So today is the first day that we start learning history. The first week, we were learning about terms and terminology, terms that are important to know for this class in preparation for the class. Today, we start learning some history. And that history, we're beginning with Native Americans before contact with Europeans, not just when they came in contact with Europeans. And so American history begins thousands of years before contact with Europeans. We don't learn very much about that. And to be fair, a lot of that history is lost. But yeah, there's a lot of it we don't know, and a lot of it we know and just don't learn. And so now, if this class is about US Latino history, why would I begin the history part with Native Americans? It's not specifically a Native American class, a Native American history class. And that's because Latinos are the result of Native Americans primarily, and then Europeans, and then Africans coming to the continent. So different Latino groups, different Latin American groups and US Latinos are the result of various combinations of indigenous, European, and African ancestry. So their history of the Americas, their history is tied the most to the Americas and to Native American people. I like this image because it shows lots of different tribal names. And again, like with Latin Americans, Native Americans is a term that's convenient for us to lump them all together, but they did not see themselves as one people prior to contact. And so yeah, they have different identities, different histories, different languages. And so, yeah, that's one thing I like about this image. So like I mentioned, US history and American history does not begin with the arrival of Europeans. For sake of kind of comparison, 1776 to 2024 is 248 years. And there's been people in the Americas at least since 30,000 BC before the Common Era. So tens of thousands of years versus, a quarter of 1,000 years. I mentioned before when I was talking about race that I recommend you check out understandingrace.org, a website for the American Anthropological Association that talks about, helps educate one about the social construction of race. And then I also mentioned this video about kind of how all peoples came from Africa, as far as we know, or sort of that's what we thought anthropologically, and now it's confirmed with DNA studies. And so combining history with that is this idea that humans came out of Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago, and then tens of thousands of years ago, people start making their way to the Americas. The first indigenous groups in the Americas are referred to as Paleo Indians, and they came in various waves from 30,000 to 5,000 years before the Common Era. And these are just some of the major groups that I'll talk about prior to contact. And I'm not going to quiz you on the specific years. Like I'll never ask, was it 30,000 or 29,000 or that's just too specific. But I do want you to have an idea of the order in which these groups were at their height. And so I want you to know that, Teotihuacan, the Olmecs, and Paleo Indians were not around at the time of contact, for example. And so I want you to have a rough idea of, which ones were around at the same time and which ones were tens of thousands of years and which ones were there at the time of contact. These aren't the only groups. These are just some of the major ones I'll talk about. And then these years are also not set in stone. Different scholars will, kind of budge the numbers a little bit. So they're not set in stone. And this is also not when the groups came into existence and then ceased to exist. They existed before this and they existed after this, after these years. These are the years at which these groups were at their height. And height, kind of judged by us in modern times as when people left most of the evidence of their existence behind. And so the people that were most hierarchical, who had rulers and common people and armies and built things, are the ones we're most likely to have evidence of having existence, and so therefore we know most about. So yeah, and I'll talk about each individual group independently, so you don't have to rush to get everything down all at once with this slide. Paleo Indians, the theory is that they came over the Bering Strait when there was still an ice land bridge between Asia and the Americas, especially right after the ice was melting, and it provided an opportunity for that to happen. They came in three major waves. The main one between 15,000 and 9,000 before the Common Era. Second one around 8,000 years before the Common Era. And these are also the ancestors of the modern day Navajo and Apache. And then the third one, around 5,000 years before the Common Era. Those are the people that are still there in, say, Alaska. And they refer to themselves as Aleut and Inuit, although we tend to know them more by the name that was given to them, Eskimos. The largest concentration of Native Americans in North America were in Meso America. Meso America is this area from the southwestern US, Mexico, and Central America. That is where most Native Americans were in North America. And so then when we learn about contact and all these accounts where Europeans would say, we arrived and there was no one here, the land is for the taking. Part of it is that, we take into account what part of the Americas they were entering, whether it was an area that had lots of people or was more sparsely populated. And then we're also going to learn about diseases and how they ended up killing 90% of the Native Americans. And that serves as another explanation for why their accounts were described in that way. All right, so here we have the center of Mexico. That's where both the Aztecs and the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan and Teotihuacan were. I'll talk more about those in a bit. This salmon-colored area is the area in which the Olmecs left most of their evidence behind. And then in this green area, southern Mexico or southeastern Mexico, also known as the Yucatan Peninsula, modern-day Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. That is where a lot of the Mayan people lived during the classic period and today. Now, some of the things that I'll be focusing on as I address these different indigenous groups, I'm going to in particular like to emphasize things that are kind of things that defy the stereotypes of Native Americans. Those are the things that I like to emphasize. And so, yeah. All right. So the Olmecs. The Olmecs were at their height for 1,000 years. From 1400 before the Common Era to 400 before the Common Era. A long time, for 1,000 years. They are referred to as the mother culture of Mexico. And that is because because all the different indigenous groups built upon, each group that would come would build upon what the previous group left behind. And so then the Olmecs are considered the ones to have established a foundation for the groups that were to come after. I did want to say this lecture is a lecture that I share in common with LAS 150. So those of you that took it last semester, you can beef up your notes, or if you don't want to sit through the lecture, I'm okay if you don't. So it's up to you. But yeah, it's just know that the whole lecture is going to be, before Native Americans before contact, which is something that a lecture that I have in common with LAS 150. So, but yeah, if anyone wants to step out, I really don't mind. It's up to you. All right. Whoops. All right. The Olmecs. One of the things that they're most known for is these colossal stone heads. They're massive. They weigh many tons. There's different theories with regard to them. We don't know what these Olmec heads were about. They could be leaders, they're like rulers. Some people believe that they are evidence of people from Africa having made their way to the Americas at some point, and kind of the phenotypes of these heads kind of resembling African people. And the natives from that area, still have some of those kind of facial features. And then a third theory is that they represent ball players. I'll talk about the Mesoamerican ball game in a little bit. And so, the one theory is that what they're wearing on their head, could be something like a crown, or it could be a helmet for the ball players. And so I'll talk about the ball players in a little bit. One of the contributions of the Olmecs to the Americas is the foundation for math, and the concept of the number 0. It's believed the Olmecs came up with the concept of the number 0 in the year 200 before the Common Era. And, if we don't know anything about that, one can think like, okay, how hard could it have been to come up with the number 0? Like, maybe just a tad bit harder than coming up with the number 1 or something. But apparently that's not the case. Apparently it's something that did not get discovered quickly throughout the world. The Olmecs came up with it 300 years before Hindus came up with it. And it was also 1,000 years before Arab mathematicians introduced the concept to Europe. So it was a kind of human accomplishment that was ahead of other parts of the world. Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan is the name of a city. We actually don't know what the people in Teotihuacan called themselves. The name Teotihuacan was the name given to that city by the Aztecs. And so they called it the city of the gods. It was at its height for 300 years, from the year 300 to 600. And had a population of over 100,000 people. Making it one of the biggest cities in the world at that time. They were contemporaries of the Mayans. So when Teotihuacan was at its height, they were trading with the Mayas. Turn off this phone. Sorry about that. Here is a model of the city of Teotihuacan. So you see 2 big pyramids and the city. It included 100 temples and 4,000 apartment buildings. Again, you know, things that we don't necessarily associate with Native Americans. Some even argue that it is from Meso American cities that the Western world got the concept of the grid pattern for cities. You know, if you look at old European cities, they're not in a grid pattern. They're kind of more haphazard. And Mesoamerican cities were, you know, in grids, often perfectly north, south, east, west. And the buildings also built in a way that resembled the landscape, but also was informed by the stars, by astronomy. They were very knowledgeable of astronomy, and you see that manifested in the way they built many of their structures. Let's see, I think I took this picture of the Pyramid of the Sun when I went to Mexico City a few years ago. Here's a drone picture of the Pyramid of the Sun. Here's this one's a Pyramid of the Moon. And here's a view of what's left of Teotihuacan from the Pyramid of the Moon. This is my brother and I at the top of the Pyramid of the Sun. And yeah, and this, you could see the Pyramid of the Moon back here. One of the things that Teotihuacan contributed to Mesoamerican civilizations that came after is there is a religious foundation. And so Quetzalcoatl is an example of a deity, a god, that was clearly present in Teotihuacan that ended up becoming important to other groups, including the Aztecs and the Mayans. Quetzalcoatl is the feathered serpent god. Quetzal, till this day, is the name of a bird. Coatl is Aztec or Nahuatl for snake or serpent. Here's some different representations of Quetzalcoatl. And this is the only deity, the only god that I'm going to ask you to know. The other ones I'm just sharing for the sake of comparison, but this is the one you'll need to know, and he'll be coming up periodically. So you don't have to know Tezcatlipoca, but here's a couple of representations. Here's a few more. Tezcatlipoca was a kind of inspired or connected to the jaguar. Tlaloc, you don't have to know either. Rain god, different representations, old and modern. And yeah, I just like this Lego pantheon of deities. All right, moving on to the Maya. The Maya were at their classic period, which is the height of Mayan civilization or civilizations, from the year 250 to 900. The Mayans tended to have city-states. So it doesn't appear that there ever was one Mayan ruler that controlled all Mayan people. Where they built those pyramids would be a city, and each city was its own state. And so, you know, they could trade, they could cooperate, or they could go to war. But they're independent from one another. Chichen Itza is, so this pyramid is from Chichen Itza. Has anyone been to Chichen Itza? It's the Mayan pyramid close to Cancun. And so when people go to Cancun in Mexico, sometimes they'll take a day trip to go to Chichen Itza. I've done that. So here's representations of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpents. Other pictures, cenotes. You don't really have to know about that in this class, but they're just sinkholes that were important sources of water. The Mayans are the Native American group of the Americas who had a complete written language. So most Native American groups in the Americas did not have a complete written language. The Mayans had a complete written language. And so here's some examples of putting these kind of consonant sounds with these vowel sounds. So this is how you write ba, be, bi, bo, bu. Or here examples of whole words like ba'alam for jaguar. Here's ka'uk for quetzal. And so forth. The Spanish did everything they could to destroy all the hundreds, if not thousands, of books that had still survived till the time of contact. But fortunately for the Maya, they literally wrote their language in stone. And so over time, we were able to decipher. In recent decades, we've been able to decipher, or not we, I didn't do anything, but anthropologists have been able to decipher it, the overwhelming majority of it. And so now Mayan people are still around, and they still speak Mayan, but now they're learning how to read and write in their Mayan language. And that's pretty awesome. Now you even have, you know, same way that you can have like apps to translate from one language to another, you could do the same with Mayan. Lots of cool things going on with that. And so a lot of Mayan history is being written for the first time in the process of deciphering all of this. But yeah, pretty cool. They had their own number system. For this class, you don't need to know how to count in the Mayan number system. You just need to know that it existed. So our number system is known as the Hindu-Arabic system that is based on the number 10. And so then, we have decimals and so forth. And each placeholder gets multiplied by 10. In the Mayan system, it's based on the number 20. And this is one of the ways in which they would write numbers, say 0 to 19. And then each placeholder gets multiplied by 20 instead of by 10. The ball game. One of the terms for the ball game is ulama, as in ule. Ule, there's natural rubber trees, and I don't know if rubber is the right term. Maybe it's more like latex. But there's, rubber trees in the Yucatan Peninsula. And so they made the balls out of that ule, it's also the same natural material from which gum was historically made before the modern version. And so anyways, they would make the ball out of that ule. The ball was not inflated, it was solid rubber. And so it's like a 8-pound ball. It's not light and it's not super bouncy. It does bounce, but not like an inflated ball. The ball courts were not, well, the ball game was not played just by the Mayans. Lots of Meso American groups played the ball game. The ball courts all look different, although kind of like an I shape was probably the most common. Kind of an I-shaped court, like a capital I. And they didn't all have that hoop either. And we also don't know, well, what's most likely is that different groups played the ball game with different rules and for different purposes. But it did have religious meaning. It could be used as a substitute for war. It's likely in some Mesoamerican groups, like the Aztecs, that the losers could have been sacrificed. There's some sources that in some groups and some times and places, the winners could be sacrificed. Yes. 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 Yeah. 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 We'll touch on El Dorado. Yeah. We also don't, again, and they probably played differently. One of the best sources we have that includes some of the rules of how they played say that they played this game without using their hands and without using their feet. So it's not basketball and it's not soccer. Something on its own. And so here's a representation of people playing using their hips. Although it's possible they used other things like, like elbows and knees and so forth. This Mesoamerican ball game, ulama, is one of the oldest continuously played sports in the world. It's the oldest known game in the world using a rubber ball. And I'll show you a few examples briefly of how people today think they played the game. Don't know what I clicked on. So here's one team trying to get the ball in one direction. They lose the ball. And then there's a team on the other side that try to get it in the opposite direction. And you see they're using only their hips. There, they got it through. So this one, kind of gives us more of the aesthetic, what they may have dressed like. And with this one, they use kind of their elbows, or I don't know, kind of the forearm. And so those are kind of, how do I put it? They're kind of like putting on a show. But there are people who play this as a sport. And as a legacy of who they are.
Dejo mi cuerpo para que la energía de mis ancestros pueda manifestarse físicamente en ese plano. Lo que yo siento por el deporte es esto desayuno, esto cena, esto almuerzo. Vida es esto desde que te paro. Macizo es de un árbol de hule. La parte más difícil de este juego es el inicio, porque se te hacen hematomas muy grandes.
Porque es un legado que le vamos a dejar a nuestros niños, a nuestros hijos, a los hijos de nuestros hijos.
Últimamente a veces deportes que es que haya un aporte a la sociedad. Para mí mi sueño más grande sería que estos jóvenes.
So yeah, there's a league, bringing it back as a sport. And they have teams in Mexico, and I believe there's one team in the US as well. Okay. They're here. I'm introducing you to three groups: the Anasazi, the Hohokam, and the Mogollon. These are three groups that were at their height around the year 1000, so about 1,000 years ago. And they are the ancestors of the modern day Pueblo people. The Anasazi left two places behind that we can still see today. They are in modern day Colorado and New Mexico. in Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. And so in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico, the Anasazi built Pueblo Bonito, and that's what this is. It is a structure that could house thousands of people. And it was a pilgrimage site. It was an important trading center. People came from long distances to trade there. There's multiple stories to the structure. Then the Anasazi after that built Cliff Palace. That's this in the bottom in modern day Mesa Verde, Colorado. And as you can see, it's kind of like an apartment building built up on the edge of the mountain or canyon or cliff. I guess hence Cliff Palace. The Hohokam, one of those three groups, built this structure also around the year 1000. That's referred to as Casa Grande, the big house. And that place today is called Casa Grande in Arizona. And so this is the original structure. These are adobe walls of structures that surrounded it. And this is a shade that was built on top of it to help preserve it. Here is a model of this 3-story house or building with a cutout so we could see what it originally looked like. And then for Mogollon, I don't have really any more information. But maybe I'll eventually add the Gila cliff dwellings. Okay. Next group I'm introducing you to is known by these two names. We don't actually know what they call themselves, but we refer to them as being part of Mississippian culture. And that's because they traded and shared, culture with all the Native American groups that were accessible through the Mississippi River and its tributaries. Another name for them is the Moundbuilders, because they would build mounds. So this group built a city called Cahokia. The city of Cahokia was at its height for 200 years, from 1050 to 1250. Cahokia was a city of 20,000 people. Now, this city with 20,000 people is important because it was the largest city in what ended up becoming the United States. For no city surpassed Cahokia in size for 800 years. It's not until I think it was Philadelphia in the early 1800s that there was a city that surpassed Cahokia. And Cahokia was sort of the Midwest. I'm not sure, sort of the mound is still there, and it's either close to St. Louis, Missouri, or Southern Illinois. Has anyone been there? Yeah. And so yeah, there's that kind of close to the Midwest. And I'm curious, I think this is pretty important to American history, especially being in the United States. So I'm curious how many of you were introduced to Cahokia or the Moundbuilders in K through 12 education here in the Midwest? Four, five of you? Okay. Cool. Good. Hopefully one day I ask that question and everyone's like, oh yeah, we know about that. But we're not there yet, so working on it. The largest mound in the city of Cahokia is Monk's Mound. It was 10 stories high. It had a base of 16 acres, making it larger than any of the Egyptian pyramids. And so an important Native American group, an important city to American history. The Inca are not as, we're not going to deal with them as much in this class as in LAS 150. And so I kind of cover them more briefly. But do know that the people we call Inca refer to their kind of like their civilization, their kingdom, their group. They refer to themselves as Teotihuacan. Inca is actually what they called their ruler. And so the people of Teotihuacan had an Inca, and the Inca that's what they called their ruler. And Teotihuacan was at its height for the 100 years before contact with Europeans. And actually they had a civil war and an epidemic right before direct contact with Europeans. And so we never got to see them at their true height. So they lived in the Andes Mountains of South America. And one of the things they're known for is these quipus. Quipus, it's kind of like a string with other strings tied to that main string. And there's knots in specific places on those strings. And this was a way to keep record of information, especially numbers. And so a historian could use these quipus to, help remember details of history. They could use them for taxation purposes of different populations. They could keep track of demographics or army supplies. There were lots of uses for these quipus. Another thing they're known for is the Capacnan. This was the royal highway system of Teotihuacan. And so it was just these paths throughout the Andes Mountains. But it was one of the largest kind of road systems on the planet. And they had 25,000 miles of that. The Capacnan. They're also known for their masonry, for their building of structures, or like in these examples, the Spanish never tore these down. They just made excellent foundations that till this day are being used as foundations for other buildings. And so we don't know how they managed to get, kind of similar to the Olmecs, where we don't know how they were able to get these huge stones to the places where they ended up when they didn't have horses or oxen or donkeys or mules. They didn't have any beasts of burden. In the Andes, they had llamas, but very limited with how much they could carry. How how they cut all these stones to fit so perfectly with one another. And, you know, how they built all this without cement or mortar. Yeah,
It's kind of going back to the Monk's Mound, but
yeah,
on the slides, it said that it was bigger than the Egyptian pyramids.
yeah.
In the video we watched, I thought it said that it was similar in size of the base, but it wasn't as big as them, or maybe it was similar in size, and it was bigger.
Yeah. You know, there's different ways of measuring, like the mass, the height. And so it could be that just the base is larger than any of the Egyptian pyramids. Yeah. The Mexica, also known as the Aztecs. They built their city called Tenochtitlan. Important not to confuse Tenochtitlan with Teotihuacan, the one I talked about earlier. So, and those terms are still here. So here's Mexica, Aztec, and Tenochtitlan. So those three terms are still down here. All right. The Aztecs called themselves Mexica. And the Mexica, based on their own stories, their own history, they say that they came from somewhere up north, from a place called Aztlan. So that's that first bullet point, Aztlan. And so the Mexica came from Aztlan, somewhere in the north, and they traveled for 200 years, making their way south. And we don't know where Aztlan originally was. Some people think it may have been somewhere in northern Mexico. Some people believe it was in the modern day US Southwest. Some anthropologists believe it could have been as far north as modern day Salt Lake City, Utah. And in fact, the Utah, the Utes, the Native American group of Utah, is of the same language family as the Aztecs, the Ute Aztecan language family. So we don't know where Aztlan was. They traveled for 200 years, migrating until they arrived to the Valley of Mexico. At the Valley of Mexico, when they arrive, they encounter the Toltecs. The Toltecs were already there. They had a hierarchical system. They were the ones in charge. The Mexica came in and they were seen as less than. Yeah, they were seen and treated as less than, but the Mexica hired themselves out as mercenaries and tried to intermarry with the Toltecs to try to kind of work their way up in social status in that society. They ended up getting on the wrong side of the Toltecs. The Toltecs banished the Mexica to this undesirable swampy area. But when they got there, the Mexica say that they saw a symbol that is a symbol that they had been looking for, which was an eagle on top of a cactus devouring a snake. And when they saw that in the swampy area, they realized that this was supposed to be their new permanent home, the place where they would build their new city after having left Aztlan so many years before. And so that's part of their legend. And so, you know, this symbol is important. And hence why today the Mexican flag has this symbol. So the Mexica built their city there. That city ended up becoming Tenochtitlan. with 200,000 people, again, one of the largest cities in the world. And let me see if I can play you this link that talks about the construction of Tenochtitlan.
Years of Tenochtitlan built up the island through great sacrifice. They
So they spent 100 years building the island, like it
reclaimed
said.
land, swampy lake, and erected stone temples.
They reclaimed the land, turning it from just swampy area to an island. And this is significant, again, I try to emphasize things that are not kind of the stereotypes of Native Americans. I mean, this is what we did in the US to Miami in the 20th century, where we reclaimed this swampy area and made a city out of it, with so yeah, and they were able to do this in the 13 to 1400s.
Causeways of hewn stone were constructed to the north, south, west. An aqueduct was built to bring in fresh water from a mainland spring 3 miles away.
Again, building these causeways, these ways of getting to the mainland, aqueducts, bringing fresh water from far away, the grid pattern to their city.
Throughout the island, to transport goods and people. They gained trade wealth and again hired themselves out as mercenary soldiers for the powerful city-states of the valley. Marriages were arranged that finally brought in honor of Toltec bloodlines. Tenochtitlan was a city on the rise. The cycle of power was turning toward the Mexica. And when war again broke out in the valley, the Mexica and their allies prevailed. In victory, they called themselves the Aztec, after the Mexica place of origin, Aztlan, land of the heralds. From this point, Aztec prophecy foretold a glorious future. The might of our powerful arms and the spirit of our hearts shall be felt. With them we will conquer all nations near and far, rule all villages and cities from sea to sea, become lords of gold and silver, jewels and precious stones, feathers and tributes. And we shall become lords over them and their lands, and over their sons and their daughters, who will serve us as our subjects. For over 80 years, the Aztec launched far-reaching campaigns of conquest, expanding their domain from Gulf to Pacific. They fought epic battles in city.
Note this place right next to them. So they're expanding in all directions, yet there's this place right next to them that they never conquered. That ends up becoming important later on. And so we'll
These states throughout the region. Most were conquered and turned into tributaries, forced to supply slave laborers for Aztec public works and pay high taxes and goods. Aztec scribes recorded the taxes of many states. Bolts of fine cloth, discs of hammered gold, exotic plants and feathers, precious stones, feathered military uniforms. Built on the backs of the tributary states, the island capital of the Aztec grew into one of the wonders of the world.
When I first opened my eyes in this world, I was born of this heritage.
I have seen the beautiful festivals we have in our villages, our dances. And it would have been like that there. They had many festivals in this place, with many beautiful dancers, wearing many brilliant colors. I think it was even more beautiful then, much more beautiful when our grandfathers lived there and followed their ways. The two-story houses of the elite were adorned with beautiful gardens.
You know, their buildings, their structures, their pyramids. Today, we see them and we see the ruins. We see what was left after 500 years. But back then, they were plastered and they were painted and they were adorned. And so, you know, they looked new and alive. Two-story houses.
They housed thousands of rare birds, and storehouses swelled with the wealth of empire. The city was cleaned daily by thousands of sweepers, its refuse collected and shipped away on barges.
The fact, you know, they had one of the largest cities in the world. It was also possibly and definitely one of the cleanest cities in the world as well. And so, and, you know, ironically, that ends up working against them because they have less exposure to germs and disease that make them more vulnerable once Europeans arrive and encounter them.
Central markets thronged with professional traders whose travels took them to far distant locations. Men who spoke many languages and often carried with them news of the world.
Yeah, so they built up Tenochtitlan into one of the largest cities in the world. At the time of contact, the Mexica ruler is known by these three names. Moctezuma is the term that is a name that you find in a lot of the original Spanish sources when they first encounter, like in Cortez's diaries, for example. Montezuma is the term that they use in Spanish today to refer to him. Oh no, I'm wrong. Sorry. Montezuma is the one we use in English. Like that Marines fight song, you know, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, so forth. Montezuma is the one we use in English. Moctezuma is a term they use in Spanish. And so yeah, just I share those three so that if you encounter different versions of the name, you know, as you're researching this individual, you realize that they're all referencing the same individual, same person.